that's the place I see strategy get stuck. But the biggest place I see people getting stuck is leaving a wonderful strategy planning session or process and then not executing it, not getting communicated in the right ways, not getting followed up in the right ways.
Okay, folks. So now on to today's topic area, making strategic planning work across the organization. Yeah, and building on the title of our conversation here, making it work across the organization. Let's pull on this idea of how do you make that happen? Who do you involve? So as I've done a fair amount of this as well, I see a couple different iterations, a couple different versions, and I'd like your reactions to this. So one version is it's kind of done in the smoke-filled room. You know, one or two or a handful of people go off by themselves, and I'm going to exaggerate a little, but it's not that much of an exaggeration, done in a vacuum in some sort. You know, they decide, and then they come forth and say, this is the direction, and the rest of the people just kind of say, aye, aye, and they follow it. Now, it's neither right nor wrong, it's just one approach.
Yeah.
Another approach is an active involvement of getting input from several different sources, inside and out of the organization, different levels, getting feedback throughout. That can take a lot more time, provide more buy-in. Back and forth, there are pros and cons to this, and of course, variations. What are your reactions as you're hearing this? What are different ways of making this process work across the organization itself?
Yeah, that's a great point. And you're right. There are different approaches. And again, there's not one size that fits all. For me, one of the keys is that if a senior leader, let's say, wants to declare the strategy for the organization, I think that can be an acceptable approach. I think that can be doable. There could be situations where that's very valuable. Think of the degree of clarity that will provide. In order to make that work across the entire organization, what becomes really important is that senior leader is crystal clear about what is not negotiable, what are the ultimate directions and outcomes that are expected of everyone. And then from there, where are the places where people can be creative, they can be empowered, they can come up with their own goals and plans and approaches to execute on that strategy. And so in a situation like that, I think you can make it work. Now, the one downside is, we know that people are more committed to something they help create, right? And so you do miss that benefit. So the idea of at any level in the organization, as you are cascading, as you're communicating, the idea of people being able to get clear about what really matters for the company. And then two, for them to be empowered to be able to contribute at their highest level to bringing that about. That's where I've seen that you get the most engagement, the most excitement, and the most alignment into the organization. So it's variable about how many individuals, how many teams can and should be involved in a process. Think of a really large organization. You could never have hundreds of thousands of people involved in a meaningful way in order to create that, right? But getting data points and getting input from employees, from your surveys that you do, from whatever data gathering you have inside, outside with customers, outside with shareholders or other key stakeholders, those inputs are extremely valuable. And you can do that without having all those people in a room with you.
So utilizing lots of different mechanisms. And what I'm hearing is it's the choices up front to be able to then be clear about what's negotiable, what's not, what needs to happen, and why we want to involve other voices. One of the challenges that I sometimes see is when voices are asked for input and then the feedback is not acknowledged or not
Right,
included or not followed up with. And
right.
that is one of the challenges. Then somebody's like, well, great. I don't see any of my input anywhere in any of this. Why'd you ask me?
Yeah, and it's a bit of a nuance and it takes some extra work, but it could be as simple as a conversation that says, "Hey, we would really love your input and give some context. We're asking for lots of input. You may or may not see your individual input represented, but that doesn't mean that we didn't hear it, that we don't appreciate it, that it didn't become part of our process." And sometimes I think that context, we're going too quickly and we don't take that extra step to explain. And so then people say, oh, well, they're always listening and never responding, right? And then it actually makes things worse, because then people have an expectation that something's going to be done with their input, and if it's not, then it can become a negative for sure.
Well, you mentioned something earlier about wanting to clarify during the process the desired outcomes and clarify that as much as possible up front.
Mhm.
So here's one of the challenges. Sometimes people don't always know what they want from this process in one of two ways. One is they don't always have a clear definition of what is strategy, what's a strategic focus area, what's a direction, what's a goal, what's an objective. These terms are used interchangeably. There's all sorts of different ambiguity around it. And the other aspect is the content of these. Is it strategic enough? Is it goalish enough? Is it objective-ish enough? Okay, Nolan, in 30 seconds, what is strategy in your view? What is a good litmus test to help define what is strategy in essence in your view?
I think for a competitive business, strategy is outlining the prioritized set of choices that an organization will make and will focus on to win. In a more mission centered organization where winning is not necessarily the objective, then I think in place of winning, it's your vision and your mission, your aspiration and your purpose for existing. And what are the choices that will help you best fulfill those two things?
Clear, all around choice. And it's focused around either the winning element or the mission or both. And then to build on that, how many strategies, how many focus areas, because that's often one of those questions around how many are we shooting for? 3, 5, 15, 38? And I'll just share a brief example. One past client of ours several years ago ended up with 38. I will admit we were not involved in that process. Later on, we became involved and found out they had 38 strategic objectives. I respect the process. My initial professional opinion was way too much. Then they created 38 task forces, and about month 3 or 4, they were so bogged down with task force meetings that the
Yeah,
rest of the operation started to suffer. Talk to us in terms of how many meetings, no, rather, how many objectives, how many strategies is the right number then?
that's a great example, and I've seen that in other organizations as well, right? Where you suffer under the weight of what you've created because it's too complex.
Right.
Um, so typically, and again, the nomenclature can change and be different, but if we said very generically an organization strategy was to win based on low cost, they're going to be lowest cost in their competitor set, then I would expect as part of that strategy that they would have no more than 3 to 5 key strategic pillars or strategic focus areas that defined broadly the choices they were going to make to be lowest cost. For me, 3 to 5 is a really good rule of thumb. Now, we could have endless intellectual debate about, well, what about 6? But the point is having few enough that it's memorable. If I can't remember the 3 strategic focus areas for my company, how am I ever going to be aligned or have my day-to-day decisions and choices and work align with those? And so now, once you have the 3 to 5 defined, sure, there's all kinds of levels of cascading, and you might have 3,800 objectives at different levels of the organization, but any individual may only have 3 to 5. And so there's that focus and there's that clarity for each individual in how they're contributing, how they are helping the company ultimately win or achieve their mission.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Nolan, especially for the strategic planning process, where do teams get stuck in this process?
Yeah, I think there's several places that tend to be kind of typical. The first place is one that we've already talked about, and it's the choice about whether to do it or not. So sometimes they get stuck and immobilized by saying, this is going to take too much time, too much effort. We have too many fires burning. There's too many urgent things happening. And so they don't do it at all. And they kick the can down the road. And what happens, of course, is they keep operating the exact same way they've been operating, and they're not making traction. They're not making progress. So that's one. A second one is, and I don't, generally I don't see this a lot, but it can happen, especially if you've got a larger executive team or team at any level that's doing this. There can be, if there are unclear decision rights, then you can get into some conflict that gets unresolved and that keeps spinning and spinning and spinning. And so that's a place where I see some teams getting stuck. Not too many, but some. Probably the biggest place that I see people get stuck, and we may not think of it as getting stuck necessarily, because stuck sounds like we're, we don't know what to do. But the biggest place I see people getting stuck is leaving a wonderful strategy planning session or process and then not executing, and it not getting communicated in the right ways, not getting followed up in the right ways, not having the integrative or the management mechanisms in place to then, communicate, implement, manage it, track it, measure it, follow up, tweak it, all of those things afterwards. I love this quote, and we could replace plans with strategy, but this quote from Peter Drucker: plans are just good intentions unless they immediately degenerate into hard work. And that's the place I see strategy get stuck. And I've told, in fact, I've told some clients recently that, look, we can walk away from a strategy session and have an amazing conversation, a beautiful document, and if it doesn't get translated into how the organization's executing, then we just wasted our time. So anyway, those are a few of the spots where I see problems.
Yeah, this implementation, I want to put a pin in this implementation because I want to spend more time on that in a moment. There have been some great comments here. Let's go first. Mary has offered a thought around where some teams get stuck is just even being able to know how to place a bet on where they want to go in the future. And she might be talking about, it's somewhat easier, and I'll say easier in quotes, to assess where you're currently at or look historically. Easier simply because you have the data. Okay, good. It's harder to be able to then assess and place bets and to agree upon where the future might be because, well, you don't know. And you have to figure out then and say, yes, this is where we're going to go. And that's a challenging thing to be able to come to terms with. And sometimes the lack of decision results, and it can perpetuate. And I don't know, Nolan, if you've been part of teams that just you do the some planning and then it just kind of never quite finishes.
Yeah, it's a great point. One tool, one approach to get after that is, as you're doing it, I mean, Mary put it out here, I think in a nice way. It's based on what you know today and based on what you are projecting about tomorrow. You could even come up with a system where you place probabilities. Now, this may not be highly scientific, but you go with what are the most likely scenarios. And Daniel, I know we've done a fair amount of work in scenario-based strategy planning, right? To look at that.
Yeah.
And so you can create the framework in a way to help the team work through that and have structure help you make some decisions based on, again, what you know today and what you believe to be most likely about the future. And this, in one sense, I think this relates to this other question that someone asked about how often the plan should be revisited and adjusted.
Yeah.
So in larger organizations, a lot of times the board will direct and will mandate to some degree strategy planning periods. A lot of times those are 3 years or 5 years. In smaller organizations or in much faster paced industries or high growth, you may need to revisit it every quarter and just do a gut check and say, is there anything we need to tweak or adjust for our next quarter? As so the timeframes are a lot, are highly variable depending on some of those factors. And to Mary's point, if you're in a highly uncertain situation, you could have those checkpoints established more frequently to be able to, even if it was an hour, right? Even if you get people together for an hour and you say, hey, let's take a look at our strategy. What has changed about the external environment and what do we need to tweak, or what do we need to schedule more time to go deeper into?
Yeah. Nolan, oftentimes during the strategic planning process, as well as during the implementation, organizations will choose to have a point person, either internal or external, or a combination of both. How and when should an organization decide when to have an internal or an external person guide and direct, facilitate some of this planning process? What's the criteria they should use to make that decision?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think some basics about the internal versus external, and if you're going to go internal, who you select. It's got to be someone that is able to be objective and impartial, right? And is aligned with whatever leader or set of leaders ultimately owns the strategy and is responsible for that. And there's got to be it's got to be someone with a strong facilitation skill set and background, as well as strategy skill set and background. And those can vary, again, depending on the complexity of the situation. And so those become critical. And what I see a lot of times, for instance, when we get brought into organizations to do this, it's not always even that they don't have people that are capable. That many have very senior and seasoned people. It's that it becomes really challenging to be objective when you have skin in the game about the strategic choices being made, and you are asked then to facilitate a process or a set of meetings. And it's human nature that you're going to tend to skew to your own agenda, the things that are in your own head without any bad intent, right? That's just the nature of it. And the other aspect I would just highlight again, Daniel, that we brought up is the other elements that come into play where there are team dynamics happening that, an external consultant and facilitator can really help with. Sometimes we even do work with clients where we are coaching some of the executives that are on that team, for example, individually. And so there can be residual benefits that way to be able to observe them in action and give feedback. And so there are a lot of different benefits. Again, there's not a right or wrong. But I do think it comes down to, are they able to be objective, and do they have the skill set required to really run, a rigorous and a structured process that will produce the right outcomes.
Yeah, that's well said.
And I've seen it. I've seen the point person, again, even when we are brought in, I've seen the point person vary. CEO, chief strategy officer, head of HR. There's a whole host of roles that I've seen kind of play this function. So
yeah. Okay, Nolan, last question, then we're going to wrap up.
okay.
What is the one thing, Nolan, that you want people to leave with to help them, enable them to make strategic planning work across the organization? What's the one thing?
Do it. Begin where you are, do it, and follow it through, right, to the point where it devolves into hard work. And even if it's super simple, even if you do it in a very small department or function within the organization, do it, learn from it, and then get better at it. Because as a capability, it's imperative for a business to grow and thrive, to be able to strategically plan, and to do it well, and to have it devolve into hard work.
Well said. Nolan, thank you for being on the Leadership Growth Hour today.
Thank you. It's been a great discussion, Daniel. I appreciate it. And thanks for everybody's engagement, comments, and questions as well.
To register for future Leadership Growth Hour events, please visit stewartleadership.com/events. We'd love to have you join us. Till next time, take care, everyone.